So this used to be my Ducati Multistrada 1000 DS 2006. I ended up trading it with a friend for a WR and decided he was gonna commission me to build him out a bike, so this is the platform. So the goal with this bike is cafe racer style, sports style, a lot of carbon fiber pieces. I've got the Indian FTR headlight cowl that I've always loved. Already got a bunch of carbon pieces on it. Already did the exhaust, started on the wiring harness, and chopped up the frame. So I've done a lot of work on this already. Didn't video it, but looking forward to kind of documenting this whole process and kind of see where this bike takes me. Dove into the wiring harness to try to figure out exactly what I need and don't need. And so far, don't need the stock speedo or ignition switch, fuse block. We'll be running a lot of Moto Gadget stuff, so should be pretty straightforward. I did run into a few wires, not really sure what to do with them. They're the CAN positive and negative. And then of course the immobilizer on the stock gauge. I'll have to send in the ECU or do it myself and deactivate that. But so far, seems pretty straightforward. Hopefully no more issues. All right, so trying to figure out where to put the intake runners for these velocity stacks. I gotta throw these in the lathe, take down this little edge piece, but weld up some pie cut stainless little runners, maybe pour them out the side somewhere over here. So I'll start messing around with some of the pie cuts and see what happens. So I've got all the pie cuts made. I may need to cut some more, but I also need to change my blade because it's clearly cutting poorly. But that's fine, I'll clean these up. So when welding stainless pie cuts, you want the edge to be as flat as possible. And so I did this as a reference. So you want to make sure there's no gaps, and it'll just make welding a lot easier. And so I have a little belt grinder that I'll take all these pieces to, clean off all the burrs and pieces that hang off, and then I will make sure they're dead flat and square once it's all said and done. And that way I'll have a nice, clean, easy weld when I start putting these together. Got the intake runners all buttoned up. I think it's about 31 pie cuts. I think it looks pretty good. I'm gonna leave the frame open on the front so you can kind of see this visually on the front of the bike. Try not to put anything else in this space in here. There is some space up above here where I'm gonna try and fit the battery and the ECU and things like that. The tank that I'm using is a 1095 tank. Surprisingly, even though this is a Multistrada frame and engine and everything else, that tank and the little fairing underneath it actually lines up pretty good. I'll throw that on the bike and give you guys an idea what it looks like. But next up, gonna chop off some more of the frame, mount the tank, battery box, lots of things to do, but we'll see when I get my hands on next. But I think I'm gonna start working on the frame. All right, got the tank roughed in. I'll go back and finish welding everything once I disassemble everything. But the 1098 tank worked out pretty well. As you can see, the lines are pretty good. I'll have to figure out what I'm going to do back here and where I'm going to cut this and make it all look and flow. But the next step would be the electronics tray. So underneath the tank, there's a good amount of room. So we'll see if we can fit the battery, rectifier regulator, some of the Moto Gadget stuff, but that's the next step. Ran into a little issue with the battery. When I mocked it up with the tank, it was a tight fit. I knew it was going to be tight, but by the time I got this 1/8" plate bent, it's hitting the tank there. So I'm going to have to cut that off, which shouldn't be an issue. The battery is already at a slant, and once the wiring harness is hooked up to the battery, it's going to hold it in place as well. So even though there won't be a little prong holding the front, it's not going to go anywhere. All right, for the electronics tray, got the battery mounted up, the ECU. I did have the rectifier regulator right here, but then decided to switch it. I didn't video it, but decided to tuck it up underneath there. I'll cut a little section, run the wires up this way. Got the coils up, and of course the Moto Gadget M unit once I get that. So it's going to be tied up in here, but we should be able to fit everything and hide all the wires. So at the end of the day, when you're looking at the bike, you're not looking at a bunch of wires running all over the place. So pretty excited. Going to move on to the next project now. with the Ducati 1098 tank, since it's not the stock tank for the Multistrada, of course there's a couple clearance issues, one of them being the inlet and outlet for the fuel lines. So this is kind of rough where they're supposed to be, or where the fuel lines need to come up, and of course this kind of braces in the way. But I'm going to cut on these two lines, gusset it right here and on the other side, and since this is the shock tower, I mean it's going to be plenty strong. I want to keep this because this will be able to help me adjust the height of the tank, make sure all the lines are good, so we'll get working on that. Just talked about cutting that out. I'll gusset that later. Once I have the frame off the bike, I will clean up all the tabs. Have a bunch of X marks on the frame for where I'm going to put little tabs for zip ties to hold the wiring harness in line with the frame so you won't see the harness that well. I mean, I got to go through and weld a bunch of things, but that'll be a lot easier once the frame's off. And still got to figure out the front end, the headlight, how I'm going to mount that, how I'm going to mount the cowl. Might bring the forks down a little bit, but still quite a few things to do. Of course, tail section's one of them. Need to figure that out. And then as for the electronics tray, still need to add the M unit and wire it and mate it with the stock harness, but that shouldn't be too bad. But making progress. I think I'll start working on the headlight or the tail section, not sure yet. So I'm going to start working on the underside of the tail section. How I'm going to go about this is once this is in place, and I weld that, it's got these two vertical lines. Even on top of the tank, there's some indents as well. So I'm going to try to carry this little indent on the underside down, kind of tie everything in. So I'm going to bend up some metal and see what it looks like. So now that the tank is mounted, all the lines are good, it's left me this space in the front of the tank, which is normally where the key goes, but it is shifted back pretty far. So I went ahead and bought the actual key plastic piece, and it's still too pretty far of a gap. I don't like it. It looks a little odd. So I'm going to end up shifting this forward and kind of building a bracket around it to kind of fill this gap in, hopefully make it look a little bit better. that the frame is completely by itself, we'll go through, cut off all these tabs, finish sanding all these spots that I've ground down, and I mean there's a lot of tabs there, here, just a bunch of things I need to take off. As well, I need to finish welding everything, but now since the frame's kind of just sitting by itself, it's a lot easier to manage, so I'll get started on that. So now it's time to add these tabs on the inside of the frame. I went ahead and marked where I wanted it, where the wiring harness is going to go. This will allow me to zip tie it in parallel with all the lines, so more or less the harness will be hidden for the most part. Now it's time for the fun process of powder coating every single bolt. And then of course all these pieces up here. I already got the frame sandblasted, powder coated. Started cleaning the bolts, putting them in my little jig to powder coat them. But yeah, I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of cleaning and a bunch of powder coating, but you get the gist. There's quite a few pieces I got to go through, but we'll get it done. Alright, so I bent out this piece of metal for the license plate bracket. There's 3 holes. Just depends on how my buddy wants to mount the plate. Up and down, of course you're going to get in trouble. Well, depending on the police, you're going to get some form of harassment potentially. Or you can mount it sideways out this way and have it the correct way. So kind of versatile, gives you 2 different options. I'll make some brackets to hold it up on this. We'll get working on it. And here comes my favorite part. Wiring. Not really, but it's okay. So got the M unit, the ECU, the battery, rectifier regulators on the other side of this. And so now it's time to take this spaghetti mess and make it look a lot better and make the bike run. So we'll get working on that. Time to start prepping for some paint. This little side tank cowl that I ended up cutting has all these little dimples and of course the verbiage here. So I'm going to sand that down, make it all smooth. Same with the tank, so just a lot of sanding coming up next. So I tried using the stock oil lines, thinking that this little plastic sheathing inside would seal with a couple of hose clamps, but definitely didn't work. So decided just to take it apart, cut off the stock little housing right here, and then I'll just get a rubber hose, and it's ribbed, so shouldn't have any issues now. But just gotta redo this, so we'll run to the parts store and get some actual rubber hose and seal this up. Well, can't always go the way you want it to. So I was just starting the bike, just figuring out the side stand switch, and yeah, I think the hose popped. It was a little bit of a tight fit onto the oil cooler, so yeah, that was fun. So let me diagnose that and fix that. Who doesn't love oil all over their garage? Well, when you have a slit in your line like that, it'll definitely, I think I got a solid 10 feet, maybe 15 feet spray. So that was a pretty good one. Here's the wiring harness, not in its final form because I still need to clean up this section and tidy up some some wires. The main reason why I'm not completed is I've ran into quite a few issues with mating the motoscope, the Moto Gadget speedometer, to link up to the stock line or the stock wires. So for example, we still have to figure these out. I don't believe I need all of them. Like the blue is a clutch line. These two greenish color ones are communications to the old speedo. I think this is part of the reason why I'm having problems picking up an RPM signal anywhere. This is the side stand switch, which is powered. I'm used to ground side stand switches, so I can start the bike, but as soon as I put it in gear, it dies. But everything else is running pretty good. I mean, this is the pickup for the RPM. And yeah, once I get it running and rideable, then I'll tape everything up and make this look even better. But it's starting to look a lot better than what I started with. What a mess. So many hours off camera that I've not filmed because wiring, it is not fun. But we'll get there. Well, I've been pretty bad with filming these last couple days just because it's all wiring and I've been hitting my head up against the wall, super frustrated, but I figured it out, had some help online, and she runs, she drives, rides, and yeah, now it's time to put it all back together and surprise my buddy with his brand new custom Ducati.